Bouie is a New York Times opinion columnist and a political analyst for CBS News. Our students are of all ages and from across the country. And I would love to know, before we dive into this topic, love to know for everybody, what is a political analyst? And then I also hear that you're a great photographer. I've seen some of your work and it's pretty impressive. So do you find mixing kind of those different skill sets together really builds upon the knowledge and your experience with teaching it and talking about it?
So first, thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think a political analyst is just a fancy way of saying someone who talks and writes about politics professionally. There's not really much content to it other than that. I myself take a kind of historical and social science approach to writing and talking about politics, and so that's what I think I bring to the job. As far as my photography goes, it's funny. I don't often think about my photography in terms of like my day job. It's sort of my hobby, but I think what my photography sometimes does is act as a somewhat. It reflects the kind of view I take to my writing. It's sort of somewhat at a remove, but very interested in sort of the larger context, the way things fit together within a scene, within a frame.
I think that's pretty amazing. And I know our students are always looking for different ways to express themselves. And so I just thought it was a really good one for students to know, like, look how our top people in our fields are writing as well as producing their thoughts and their ideas through imagery. Very fun. So sorry I had to sneak that in there for our kids. So today we're going to be quizzing you and Tom in different parts of the Constitution and voting rights. I wanted to start with you and ask you a base question that came in through the registration from our students. And the students wanted to understand fully, and again, this is from all different ages. This came in multiple times. What are voting rights in America? What's that idea and that concept of voting in America? Can you give us kind of a nutshell of that?
Sure. I think looking historically, the concept of voting rights is very much tied into the basic idea of American citizenship, which is that individual Americans have a kind of entitlement, a right, you would say, to not just choose their elected leaders, but really have a say in the governance of the country. And the story of voting rights over the course of American history is the story of who is included in that kind of category of the person who has a right to have a say, not just into their elected leaders, but into how the country, how their community is actually run.
Fascinating. So it really gives us a place and a space to have voice and agency in our whole America and our whole country.
Right. That's right.
Got it. So Tom, this is that foundational historical, constitutional question for you. Where is voting rights in the original Constitution, that structural Constitution?
Sure. Thanks so much, Carrie. So in the end, you're not going to be able to look at the original Constitution, that Constitution that was written in 1787, ratified shortly thereafter, and find a right to vote. It's not in there. It's not in the Bill of Rights. But what you do find in the original Constitution are certain principles that are going to guide how politics are going to work in the United States. So, when I think about the structural Constitution, I usually think of it as really uniting around one big idea, which is that idea really is that when it comes to voting, when it comes to elections in America, that it's going to primarily be an issue for the states to decide. And so at least as to the structural Constitution, it ends up being a story of federalism, a story of state power. But importantly, and Jamelle writes very powerfully about this as well when he talks about history, is that the American story, though, becomes something different based on the amendments that we see thereafter. And so if the original Constitution is really organized around federalism and state power, what we see are two big themes after that. One of the big themes is that over time, with the constitutional amendments, we bring more people into the story of we the people. More people can lay claim to the right to vote, and that's everything from the 15th Amendment, where we guarantee the right to vote based on race, the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage, and then even the 26th Amendment, where we bring in those 18 and older. And so we have that. And then with each of those amendments too, we see a rebalancing of the authority and powers between the states and the national government, where each of those amendments give new powers to Congress. So if we have the original Constitution and the Bill of Rights often speaking about the way in which government is limited, we see in this context with the 15th 19th and 26th Amendment, more power to the national government. And we still, though, end up asking the same question, which is what authority goes to the national government? What authority goes to the states?
Can I just to build off of that really quickly? The 15th Amendment specifically, since it's part of the Reconstruction Amendment, the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, the 14th Amendment, which establishes equal protection and birthright citizenship. If you consider those three together, I think the clear idea is not just an expansion of voting to a new category of people, but really investing the federal government with the power to protect people's right to vote, protect people's civil rights. The context in which these amendments are happening is the violation of people's rights on the state level. And so the largely men involved in crafting these amendments, Charles Sumner, John Bingham, I believe is his name, are Lionel Trumbull. They are concerned primarily with how do we protect the formerly enslaved and other people in the states. How do we protect their rights? How do we secure their rights from the position of the federal government?
That was actually my next question for you, is like, for our students, let's unpack what was going on at the end of the Civil War and talk about the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment and how it's protecting people and giving people more voice and agency to build the government and the America that they want. Now, thank you for jumping there and going right there for us. But my next question is about that power that's given in those amendments to Congress. Fast forwarding to 1924, we look at the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, and then we look at the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That's a huge amount of time between what happens at the end of Reconstruction, this boom of these amendments, this boom of what I like to refer to as the first civil rights movement. And then we have these acts that start to come into play in the 20s and the 60s, 1960s. What happens in between there that these, and why does it take Congress so long?
I mean, this gets to something that I think is just sort of an important point when it comes to thinking about constitutions generally, and certainly our Constitution, which is that the words on the paper are important, but the words on the paper don't carry force in and of themselves. They require political actors on the ground, and they require a politics, a consensus to realize them and to bring them into effect. And so the Reconstruction Amendments on paper empower the federal government to protect civil rights, empower the federal government to protect voting rights. But the politics of the 1860s and 1870s and 1880s are not geared towards the protection of the rights of African Americans, the protection of the rights of other minorities, certainly not the protection of the rights of women and Native Americans. So the reason it takes so long is essentially the country is going through a long-term political struggle over the meaning of the amendments. And then once that meaning has been established, competition and struggle over competing meanings, disagreements about what they mean, and an effort to broaden the meaning beyond what the politics of the era had established. And so in the 1870s, 1873, I believe, maybe a little earlier, maybe a little longer, maybe a little later, but there's a big debate in Congress over civil rights legislation. It's sort of one of the last big debates in which you see Black lawmakers engaged in the discussion until really the 1960s and 1970s. And you see in this debate these alternative and competing ideas about what these amendments mean. You see one faction of Congress, of lawmaker, argue that they're quite limited, that they don't protect African Americans from discrimination by private business, they don't protect necessarily the voting rights. You see African American congressmen argue the opposite. And you can think of the time between, the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments and the Voting Rights Act in 1965 as the time it took for the perspective of the African American congressman to really win the day in political conflict.
So almost 100 years. You're almost at 100 years. Whenever our students ask, and I think this it bears. We love that line that you said. You said, and I'm going to butcher it, so please correct me when it gets. The words on paper do not carry force without the people on the streets, and the consensus building around the movement. That's a really bad summary of that awesome thing that you said. Feel free to correct me. But one of our students was like, what does consensus actually mean? Like, what does that mean? I think that's a great question. And I love when they ask us to explain our words. So can you kind of explain what you mean by consensus building?
Sure. I think what it means is it means a political settlement. Not that everyone agrees, right? But that one particular faction, group of factions, coalition of people have essentially through electoral organizing, through other kinds of organizing, essentially set the terms for the larger political debate. In the 1870s, the coalition that won that was essentially a coalition that wanted to look beyond the Civil War and Reconstruction, did not care much about the fate of African Americans in the South, and wanted to reunite the country around a consensus that sort of excluded African Americans and other groups. And much of the story of civil rights politics after that period is of African Americans and their allies, few and far between as they may have been, using every available avenue, whether legal or political, to challenge that coalition and to establish sort of a new grounds for politics, for a more inclusionary grounds for politics. And that takes a long time. It depends on events as much as it does individual people and individual victories. Maybe it does not happen without the Second World War kind of creating the conditions in American society overall for greater inclusion. Maybe it doesn't happen without the Depression creating the need for a more activist government. Everything kind of hinges on events and contingencies, but the core, I think, are individuals, are groups, are communities using kind of the tools and the paths they have available to challenge whatever the settlement is and unsettle the consensus.
In so many of these classes, we're looking to the Constitution, and one of our students said a couple of weeks ago, we're looking to the Constitution to see where we have power. And I love that kind of like line that they're looking and trying to unpack it. Now, when we talk about like this change over time, I love that you bring up the World War II and how that plays into effect, because when we study history, we see it's like a food web. Like if you ever remember studying the food web and like that ocean creature, and it's the blue whale actually eats the shrimp, like all these, it's all connected, and there's a million things at play. So Tom, can you kind of like expand on for that a little bit around how women play into this role, how Native Americans and the immigrants as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, and you know, one thing to realize is if we even just begin that story at the ratification, the debates over the 15th Amendment and their ratification, so ratified in 1870, we even see right there the Republicans in Congress and their allies are making a decision that you also have women pushing for the right to vote then as well. And they make a decision that at that point in time that they're going to prioritize African-American male voting rights over women's voting rights. And this ends up splitting the suffragist movement. So the women who are fighting for the right to vote from the earlier in the 1800s onward are often shoulder to shoulder, also fighting against slavery and also fighting for universal equality after the Civil War. And so it's to say that even when progress is made, it can create friction between old allies. And so, you know, from 1870, it would take us an additional 50 years until 1920, where we finally ratify the 19th Amendment and secure the women's right to vote. And how does that happen? Well, it ends up being in part a story about federalism. So we have women beginning to vote out west in the late 1800s. We also have advocacy in state legislatures throughout the country and eventually also in Washington. And so what we see is that out west, women begin to vote. People are worried about it. It seems very radical, but we find that generally it works fine. Women are up to the task and up to the responsibilities of equal citizenship. We see the women's vote move from the west towards the east. And furthermore, we see states experiment in different ways about how women may vote. Some of them grant women full equal suffrage. Some of them say, you know, women originally, you know, at first you could vote maybe in the presidential election for the electors in the Electoral College. Maybe you can vote in school elections. But by the time we get to the 19th Amendment in 1920, you have women voting in states throughout the country having equal suffrage rights. You have women voting in other elections variously throughout the country. And so we see, again, sort of this experiment at the state level combining with advocacy by women and their allies, all culminating in a constitutional amendment, the 19th Amendment. The coda to that, though, and this can even transition us, I want to say something about Native Americans and immigrants, but I want, looking ahead to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, what we know with the ratification of the 19th Amendment is that there was a lot of work that we still had to do. Women of color still did not have equal voting rights. And so it would take multiple decades after that, with the civil rights movement culminating in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, where we can really, really begin to lay claim to both the promise of the 15th Amendment, ending racial discrimination in voting, and women's rights, voting rights, which we get in the 19th Amendment. It eventually culminates in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So we'll say more about that in a moment. When it comes to just the Native American story, as you sort of flagged, Curry, we often see in these voting rights stories a combination of what's written into the Constitution, and then what powers does Congress have to further enforce the promises of those amendments and make them real in practice. And so, we'd have to wait until 1924 with the Snyder Act to have equal citizenship for Native Americans. And it wouldn't be until 1957 that Utah would be the final state that legalizes voting for Native Americans. And so that ends up being quite a longer story.
And this is what I love about these sessions. They go so fast because there's so many good stories that we need to tell. Good stories, and I mean those, sometimes they're tragic stories, but they're important stories that we need to know and understand. Okay, so back to you, Jamelle Bouie. So Voting Rights Act of 1965. I know a lot of our questions, Craig already asked a question about Shelby v. Holder. Can you give us what did the Voting Rights Act of 1965 really set up? And then can you talk a little bit about Shelby v. Holder and what that court case did?
So the voting rights, let me rewind. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 ends discrimination and private accommodations. Basically, it sort of outlaws the legal architecture of Jim Crow, but it leaves a sort of missing piece, which is that you can go into a hotel, you can go into a restaurant and not be discriminated against, but states can still devise these, Rube Goldberg measures for blocking people from voting. I think one thing that it's worth noting is that many of the Jim Crow voting restrictions weren't explicitly based on race. They did not say, African Americans cannot do this. They were ostensibly neutral laws that targeted conditions that African Americans were more likely to have, right? So it's a grandfather clause that says, oh, you cannot register to vote unless your grandfather voted, by definition excludes most African Americans. Poll taxes in a society, the Jim Crow South, where most African Americans aren't just working class, but well under the poverty line, poll taxes, which often registrars had kind of discretion on who could pay them, excluded large numbers of African Americans. So there are all these methods states have devised for keeping blacks away from the polls. And the Voting Rights Act is sort of designed and passed basically to stop them. And not just to stop them, but to provide avenues for the federal government to prevent those states from doing this again. And so kind of the two most important sections of the Voting Rights Act are Section 2, which allow the federal government to file suit against states, allow the federal government to respond to allegations of discrimination in voting as they emerge, in Section 5, which instead of having a situation where the federal government must react to voting rights violations, Section 5, the pre-clearance section, essentially says, in these jurisdictions where there are histories of voting discrimination, those jurisdictions have to affirmatively come to us and say, we're going to do this, and then we have to approve it. As far as changing voting laws, it puts the onus on the jurisdiction to prove that they are not discriminating before they do anything. And this ends up being very powerful. Prior to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, African American voting registration in the South is abysmally low, in the single digits. There are virtually no black office holders. 10 years later, registration rates are equal to those of whites, and there are hundreds of new elected officials in the South. It really is, arguably one of the most important pieces of legislation in American history for expanding the scope of American democracy. So Shelby County v. Holder, 2013 case, is a county in Alabama, Shelby County, and please correct me if I'm getting details wrong here, um, uh, sort of sues and says that it is basically unfair for us to be under the pre-clearance regime. And the Supreme Court, in a narrow ruling, agrees with Chief Justice John Roberts, writing that the pre-clearance formula, as set out, violates something he calls equal state sovereignty. That states have to be treated the same, have to be treated equally, and it's unfair to burden states on the basis of this past history, especially given the distance between the present and the past. And that ruling essentially killed the pre-clearance section as it existed. There's still space for Congress to develop a new pre-clearance formula to achieve the same effects. But given the divided Congress and the ways in which voting rights have become politically polarized, there's really no realistic chance of that happening. And so that's kind of where we are, that the Voting Rights Act, Section 2 is still in effect. There's obviously sort of still inertia from this, and there are obviously still many officials who take seriously the goals of the Voting Rights Act. It was only 14 years ago that Congress almost unanimously reauthorized the Voting Rights Act, and President George W. Bush signed that reauthorization. So there's still some measure of consensus there, but without the pre-clearance section in effect, it has been the case that states that want to take steps to erect obstacles and burdens to voters have been able to do so with little resistance other than people filing suit and hoping that the federal courts can reverse those policies.
Tom, did you want to add anything before I move to the next question? I just wanted to give you a moment.
Sure. I mean, the only thing I'll add is, Jamelle gave the majority opinion. It is notable, Shelby County v. Holder divided the court. It was 5-4. It had a powerful dissent by the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who effectively, it's an interesting dissent, so I just wanted to flag it for everyone, because as Jeff always says, we love to give homework here at the National Constitution Center. And one of the things is to make sure that in important, tough constitutional cases, read the majority, read the dissent, decide who you think has the better of the argument. And what Justice Ginsburg ends up saying is, one, we, the Supreme Court, originally said that the Voting Rights Act was strong constitutional medicine, but it was constitutional. Two, the Voting Rights Act is consistent with the 15th Amendment's text and history, which gave a broad role for Congress to protect the voting rights of all based on race. And that finally, the Voting Rights Act actually worked over time. And so that because it worked, it could be dangerous to take away some of its most powerful mechanisms. I mean, the last piece is that, what the majority says is they agree that Congress can pass something like the Voting Rights Act and even something like the pre-clearance requirement, which again effectively says if you have a bad voting history in your state or other jurisdiction, you have to come to the federal government and show us how you're going to change your laws before you can change them when it comes to voting. And the majority even says that's okay, but what you have to do is you have to write a new formula that covers recent abuses. What you're doing with the Voting Rights Act as it exists is using a formula back from the early 1980s or the 1970s. So I just wanted to sort of flag that.
And a real quick follow-up from Jeff. Can you please give some examples of where and what states have taken action since this case? So are we seeing any changes in the state at the state level once Shelby v. Holder ruling came out? Good question, Jeff.
So pretty much like within days of the ruling coming down, several states passed these strict voter identification laws. Some of them are later, I'm sure I have the terminology wrong, but I'll just say struck down by courts after litigation. But in the 7 years since Shelby County, many states, several dozen states have passed voter ID laws. Some states like North Carolina and Wisconsin and Texas and Florida have passed laws that sort of reduce the number of polling stations, make it more difficult to do registration drives, have voter ID that critics say is discriminatory because maybe you can't use a student ID or an ID for social services, but you can use a gun license or a hunting license. And so it's been pretty immediate. The interesting thing about all of this, as far as the effects, is that although these measures have they do on the margins reduce the number of people going to the polls. The sort of the action against them, the political action against them, has had this effect of counteracting the effect that they have. So you pass a voter ID law, people get very mad about it, and then they go to vote to show that they're mad about it. I don't think that means that the passage of those laws is okay, but it does suggest that the effect is going to be diminished just by the fact that you're mobilizing people. One effect of the post-Shelby voting changes has been, and we're seeing this year, are long lines at polling stations. Sort of the reduction in electoral resources, often in areas that are predominantly African American or Hispanic, has led to these long lines, 30 minutes, hour, 2 hour, 3 hour long lines that I think should be considered a real burden on people's ability to vote.
And this is the political analyst coming out in you, which I love. When you see kind of like, voting ID laws or any kind of discussion around voter registration or who can vote and show what ballot, we see an increase in all sides going out to vote after that as well. Like that's a multi-partisan reaction to, is everybody votes more, correct?
Right, that's right. Again, I tend to think that I tend to think that states and the federal government should look at voting as something that they want citizens to do. And so while there ought to be, protections to make sure that there isn't any, shenanigans happening either on the voting side or the registration side or the ballot collecting side, I think it's also, it's out of keeping with the spirit of the Constitution, I think, to erect barriers to voting, regardless of sort of the justification for them.
And that's really Matthew's question in the Q&A here. Is like Matthew's saying like it feels like voting is polarized right now. And was that always the case? Did it just become polarized? Is that just a feeling? Like it seems strange that we would have this feeling towards voting. And is that a trend? Tom, do you want to do like a historical lens on that? And then we'll jump to Jamelle to tell us like, what are we seeing today?
Sure. I mean, I will say that the two of the themes you'll see of voting over time is one, voting is a way in which groups that are left out of power lay claim to equal citizenship. So there is a tradition of dissent that runs through a lot of American history where if you are left out and not given the right to vote, you're going to fight for it because you think that's what it is to be a full American. And so that's just something as a matter of political debate we've seen over time. And often when there are pushes towards reform, we see great political polarization and tension. So, Jamelle talked about Reconstruction. Well, we had, a brief, all too brief period of time, but a real period of time where we had interracial democracy in the South, a true second American founding, where we had African-American governors, senators, members of the US House of Representatives, state legislators, and local officials. But then we saw a backlash against it. And we saw polarization between Republicans and Democrats over that particular issue within the Republican Party, between Republicans. And then we eventually see a consensus that cuts against African-American voting rights. And we see similar friction as women are fighting for the right to vote in the 19th Amendment. And so there is something about voting where on the one hand, we see pushes for reform over time by different groups really thinking that that's what they need for equal citizenship, and then a countervailing backlash against it. So at least historically, that's what similarly when the civil rights movement is pushing for voting rights in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, you see it there too.
Now to you, Mr. Bouie, that same question, and it's coming in multiple ways through the Q&A box and through the questions is, are we seeing this polarized angle of voting? And then Jeremy added, and how is COVID playing a part in this as well? We got a lot going on right now in the world, just a lot going on.
All right. The polarization, unfortunately, it is the case that there are political movements, political factions, political parties that do not see their interests served by large numbers of people voting. That's sort of the story of the emergence of the Jim Crow South, which doesn't come immediately after Reconstruction. It takes more or less a generation for it to come into being, is Southern elites believing that their interests, their economic and political interests, are threatened by not just the voting of African Americans, but the voting of a whole class of white farmers, working class whites in the South who had in that for kind of a 10-year period had been voting with African Americans in several states to kind of upturn the political system. And so these elites decided, we're just going to basically put a lid on voting in general. And the Jim Crow voting laws that they pass end up not just disenfranchising Black Americans, but pretty much disenfranchising most lower income whites too. You see registration rates kind of drop across the board racially in the South. And I think in the present, there are political figures who just do not believe that wide-scale voting is favorable to their interests. They don't think they'd be able to win and advance the kind of policies they want to advance if they had to appeal to a large and diverse electorate. And so I think that's where the polarization comes in. Now, whether that's true, right? Whether it's actually true that a lot of people voting harms their interest is, I think, not the case. I think that it's perfectly possible to compete when everyone is voting, but it may require you to make compromises where you don't want to make compromises. And I think that's kind of the issue. As for COVID, I think in the beginning, in March and April, during those primaries where we saw the long lines, I think that reflected kind of the impact of the pandemic on voting administration. But since then, in places that have prepared, there have not been particularly long lines. I live in Virginia, and Virginia's had early voting since late September. And there's only one, in the city, there's only one place to go vote early, but it's not as if people are waiting in line for an hour or 2 hours to cast a ballot. That things are moving very smoothly because the city has prepared quite well for an uptick in voters, an uptick in the number of people who are going to want to vote early, greater interest in voting, so on and so forth. So I think COVID can't explain, maybe can explain some of the long lines. It can't explain all of it. Neither can, there's been talk that maybe there aren't enough volunteers. Most of the available information is that actually, election officials have too many volunteers. A lot of people really want to come and help vote. I can say, just to use my own life as an example, my dad, who lives in South Carolina, is working as a poll worker for the first time. He's in his mid-50s for the first time in his life because, the local election board said that we need people to help out. And he wanted to make sure that the older people, older than him, who usually did this thing, weren't being exposed to COVID. So he figured he would volunteer. And I think that's the thing you're seeing across the country. What we do know, however, is that the one thing that is absolutely associated with the long lines is just a lack of electoral resources, meaning fewer voting machines, fewer polling stations themselves, fewer paid polling workers. And those are things that don't land uniformly. And Georgia, we've seen over the past couple of weeks, now that early voting has begun, that the places where people are waiting 3 or 4 hours, 5 hours in line to vote are often, a short car ride from precincts where people can get in and out in 15 minutes. And the difference there really does appear to be kind of the racial makeup of the precinct and the income of the precinct. Higher income, whiter, easier time voting. Lower income, Blacker, more Hispanic, harder time voting. And that's been kind of the pattern wherever you see these very long lines.
And I think, and I know we have to wrap up in 1 minute, but that was the question that Bonnie had in there is, how are we seeing barriers to voting? And sometimes it can be very practical. If you are in a line for a really long time, you may not be able to stay in that line, right, because you have to go pick up your kid.
You have to go work. You have to go pick up your kid. You have to, I mentioned poll taxes earlier. I think that you can think of those sort of long lines as a kind of poll tax, a tax that you're paying in time and in lost wages to cast a ballot.
So we do have to wrap up now. I do just want to note to both Tom and you that there are a lot of comments from our students in the chat about 16-year-olds being able to vote. And I know the 26th Amendment was passed very quickly during Vietnam to have 18-year-olds vote, but I just wanted to make sure that you both know, since you're teaching and you're talking and you're analyzing the right to vote, the 16-year-olds want some stake in the game. Now, remember, students, voting is not the only way that you are an active citizen. Remember to look to the Constitution for where the power is and think about how you can build consensus to move things forward in your area. in your state. Every state's very different. Pennsylvania is really late in getting the voting places open. That's because there was lawsuits. So it's very different for each state. And that's why Tom keeps talking about federalism. But Mr. Bouie, I want to thank you so much for joining us for class. Are any like wrap up words you'd like our students to go out with as we end this voting discussion in America?
I think reading history is very important, and I think it's a really important way of helping to understand the country, helping to understand the Constitution, and sort of everything that goes into it. So I would highly encourage students to read American history, and there's a lot of great resources. The other thing I'd say, just on the 16-year-old voting thing, I think young people younger than 18 should be able to vote. I have this crazy idea that 13-year-olds should be able to vote. So even if you can't, kind of prepare yourself to be a voter, because I think it's really important, and I think that you ought to have that kind of say in the country's governance.
It's awesome. I love it. And now you've won with all the 13-year-olds. Tom, you want to give a wrap up as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing to keep in mind, and you're going to continue, we've seen a lot of constitutional cases around COVID and voting, and it's always to keep in mind the constitutional dimension of these cases. It's putting this question of federalism, this question of state power, and how we're going to define which powers go to the national government, which powers go to the states.
That's awesome. And remember, everybody, we're in the middle of it right now, in the middle of this amazing moment in history. So pay attention, read, but join in, because this is going to be a memory that you have, and you'll be the next primary source for other people to say, this is what happened this year, this is what was going on, and this is what I know about voting rights today and tomorrow. So thank you both so much for joining us. This was definitely a fun Friday session and really engaging and something that matters to all of us. Thank you, Mr. Bouie. Thank you, Mr. Donnelly. This was great to have you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.